Hello and welcome to you all. And welcome to the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, the Symposium. Hello, welcome to you all here today. Firstly, may I start by acknowledging, paying my respects and gratitude to the traditional owners and custodians of the land where we sit, stand and meet on here today, tonight, tomorrow and always. The First Nations people, the Bidjigal people. And I pay my respects and give gratitude to my elders, past, present, and future emerging. And I bring to mind and light all their many endeavours and attributes and achievements into Australian society where they have been denied. Today we stand tall in all that we do and give to our country, Aboriginal Australia, and to your mammoth education learning institution that sits on sacred land that we share with you and all, your students from the many countries across the world. Thank you.
Well, hello, friends and colleagues from Australia and around the world. It is my great pleasure as the President and Vice Chancellor of UNSW Sydney to have the opportunity to say a few words at the start of this important event. And I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands from which I join today's symposium, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I also want to begin by acknowledging the great array of expert speakers that you have today: Robin Carhart-Harris, Michael Farrell, Wayne Hall, Rebecca McKettin, Nadine Ezard, Jonathan Brett, and Liam Aitchison. And I offer a warm welcome to all delegates to the 2021 National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre Annual Research Symposium. It's my hope that many of the lessons that we've learnt from the pandemic will stay with us even when the worst of this crisis has passed. For many of us, it provided an opportunity to reflect on and restore the balance in our lives. And although meetings, events, conferences and deadlines didn't stop, thanks to the technology of the type we're using now, lockdowns did become a circuit breaker of sorts, giving us a chance to step back and consider the way we live and work. But for so many battling addiction, COVID added another layer of complexity to their lives. A greater vulnerability to the virus itself, social isolation and marginalization, exacerbation of mental health issues, whilst at the same time, the support services upon which they may have relied were dealing with increased demand coupled with restrictions on face-to-face delivery of care. If there's a positive those of us in academia can take from the past 18 months, it is that the voices of experts have been amplified during the COVID crisis. UNSW's National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, NDARC, not only has some of the world's leading experts on substance abuse and drug addiction, but over its more than 30 years, it's proved a vital source of information for policymakers, and it continues to do so. One of the first people that I had the privilege of meeting at UNSW when I started 7 years ago was Michael Farrell. And during those 7 years, I've watched with admiration his leadership of NDARC and the great work of the team in the centre, who make such an impact on people's lives and make such a contribution towards our university's bold, ambitious, and importantly, altruistic 2025 strategy. And I mention that strategy because of the relevance of the strategy's priorities: academic excellence, innovation, engagement, and social impact. Those are priorities that have guided the UNSW community's decision-making as we strive to make a powerful difference in people's lives. And one of the most important aspects of the strategy is not just our objectives, but how we go about pursuing them. I've had the privilege of having over 40 years in medicine research and academia, and I've seen the best ideas and outcomes come from collaboration, and importantly, from a spirit of generosity of partnership in which expertise is shared, differing views embraced, and a variety of experience respected. There is simply no more efficient or effective way of working. And as Vice-Chancellor, I was keen to build on the commitment to collaboration that was already a trademark of UNSW. I wanted to embed a rich culture of collaboration into the UNSW way of doing things across disciplines, institutions, borders, and with industry and government. NDARC is an exemplar of just that. Having collaborated with the top researchers from other universities and research centres, health services, criminal justice agencies, and alcohol and other drug service providers in Australia and globally. This symposium, with its remarkable lineup of local and international speakers, will further cement the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre as a hub of research excellence and collaboration. Session 1 today will explore emerging pharmaceutical trends, including psychedelics and innovative drug treatments for addiction and mental health disorders. Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, head of the renowned Centre for Psychedelic Research in the Division of Brain Sciences at Imperial College, will give the keynote address shortly. And I welcome Dr. Carhart-Harris to UNSW, albeit virtually, and to this symposium. But before I finish and hand over to the director of NDARC, Professor Michael Farrell, I want to say a few words about Michael. We've been fortunate to have someone of Michael's caliber leading NDARC for 10 years. His research is as impressive as his leadership of NDARC and his commitment to nurturing talent and careers. Michael is passionate about the work of NDARC, and he delivers that passion through a calm, respectful, and collected style of leadership, which has established NDARC as an international leader in generating high-quality research and evidence on the prevention and treatment of addiction. And I'm particularly impressed by the way that he's ensured that cutting-edge research is translated into strong and impactful policy and clinical practice. And just one example of that is the international collaborative approach, which led to a landmark report published in 2019 in The Lancet. And that has continued through the COVID-19 crisis with a laudable commitment to doing the very best for some of the most marginalized people in our society. So to Michael, to the NDARC team, to all the guest speakers and delegates, your work is invaluable, and I wish you all the very best for a productive and rewarding symposium.
Thank you very much, Ian, for those very kind words. And also, I wish you the best in your next adventure. And I do hope we will maintain very good contact. Today, I'd like to welcome you all to the NDARC Research Symposium. This has been another challenging year in which we had hoped to have this as an actual real in-person symposium, but now we are virtual, and we are very happy to be able to do that. Again, thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, and also thank Auntie Barbara Sims for her welcome to country. Dispersed as we are today over many lands, could I also welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, both past and present. Now, this year we will be hosting the symposium with 3 online sessions today, tomorrow, and Friday. And we're highlighting a wide variety of the research taking place both internationally and at NDARC, and trying to bring some experts together in the field of emerging pharmaceutical drugs today, looking at psychedelics and new drug treatments for things like methamphetamine dependence and withdrawal. And tomorrow we'll be looking at global patterns in opioid dependence and treatment. So that being said, I hope you have already registered for the sessions tomorrow and the next day, and that you will, and if you haven't, please go ahead and register online for those sessions. The sessions today is emerging pharmaceutical drugs, including psychedelics and new drug treatments, and that will continue until 11:30. Tomorrow it's global patterns in opioid dependence and treatment, and past history and current interventions and future action. And David Courtwright from the United States, who's a renowned historian, will talk on that, as well as Louisa Degenhardt. And on Friday, and session 3, we'll have the 2021 Australian Drug Trend Reports. And along with those, we'll have a range of posters and a range of different presentations. Our first session today, as Ian has mentioned, will explore emerging trends, including psychedelics and innovative drug treatments. And Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris will talk, as introduced by Ian. And then the program beyond that will be, there'll be a panel discussion after that, then a presentation from Jonathan Brett, then a presentation from Nadine Ezard, and then a presentation from Liam Aitchison, and then Rebecca McKetton on aspects of methamphetamine treatment. And this presents a broad range of in-depth work around the very challenging area of methamphetamine dependence. And that's followed by a Q&A discussion, poster session. And then, because we've had such a large volume of people registering for this, we have extended the Q&A session to have an additional Q&A session after the poster session, and we'll have some closing remarks. You can actually get the full program, and the presentations will be available to people afterwards, and they will be available on demand on the NDARC website. And we would encourage you both to look at those and to actually share some of those things with your own network. They're easily shareable. And so I'd like to thank you all for joining, and I hope you'll enjoy these. And the other thing to talk about is the Q&As. In terms of putting in questions, if you could use the Q&A and not the chat section, use the Q&A. We will try and respond to some of them along the way, and we'll try and condense them depending on the volume of them. We'll try and condense them into key points for the discussion. So I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Robin Carhart-Harris. He's a clinician and neuroscientist and head of the Center for Psychedelic Research at the Division of Brain Sciences in Imperial College London, working with Professor David Nutt. And he has coordinated the first clinical study of psilocybin, which was actually recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and has also had a very lively and interesting BBC documentary on it, and has grabbed worldwide attention to it. So over to you, Robin. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, first of all, thank you very much to Professor Farrell for the invitation to give this presentation. It's an honor to speak to you. I'm here in Berkeley, California, and recently appointed head of the division for psychedelic research within Neuroscape at UCSF here. And my presentation will take a multi-level approach. I am focusing on brain mechanisms, brain and therapeutic mechanisms, and we'll begin that approach at the level of the drug acting at its key site of action, and that's the serotonin 2A receptor. In a sense, the pharmacology of classic psychedelics is the crispest way to define these compounds, that they all act as agonists or stimulating drugs, stimulating signaling at a certain serotonin receptor, and we know that to be the serotonin 2A receptor. Where is that serotonin receptor in the brain? Well, the latest in vivo human brain imaging work has shown us that it's very much a cortical receptor. You can see this heat map here from Gita Knudsen's team in Copenhagen, using a radioactively labeled ligand, in itself a psychedelic drug, highly selective for the serotonin 2A receptor, labeling those receptors. And we can see the strong binding in the cortex, throughout the cortex, but especially so in high level, what you could call transmodal association cortex. And as we'll see as we move through, this is important. The hierarchically speaking, high apical location of these serotonin 2A receptors. We know that the 2A receptor is critically important to the action of classic psychedelics for a few reasons. It was discovered in the mid to late 1980s that there's a very strong relationship between the affinity of a range of different psychedelic compounds and their potency. So, for example, LSD has a very high affinity for the serotonin 2A receptor and is remarkably potent, psychoactive in doses in the microgram range, around 15 micrograms. Recently, it's been found. Remember, there are 1,000 of those in a milligram and 1,000 of those in a gram. If we look at mescaline and its psychoactivity, its subjective effects, it's another psychedelic compound, the one taken by Aldous Huxley when he wrote the famous essay on his mescaline experience, The Doors of Perception. And there he took 400 milligrams, so close to half a gram of mescaline. And we could have predicted that by the relatively low affinity of mescaline for the 2A receptor. So that affinity, that stickiness, if you want, that binding potential for the 2A receptor is critical to these drugs' potency. We also know that the 2A receptor is critically important because if you block it by giving an antagonist, a blocker, before you give the agonist, then people won't feel the effects. Animals won't show the behavioral markers of psychedelic effects, and also the brain activity signatures you won't see if you pre-treat with a 2A blocker. And we also have this evidence again from Gita Knudsen's team, looking at displacement of the hot ligand with different dosages of psilocybin and working out the percentage occupancy of 2A receptors by those different dosages of psilocybin. And what we see when we look at this curve, they plotted it as quadratic, probably too early to say that there are non-linearities here, but it's easy to intuit there might be. What do I mean by that? That you go above a certain dosage and the intensity of the experience leaps up, it inflects upwards. And there's some suggestions of that here, but really the important point is that indeed there is a relationship. The higher the dosage of psilocybin, the more receptors being occupied, and that's translating into more intense experiences. So the 2A receptor, very important. What does it do? Well, now there's a wealth of evidence that 2A signaling links to plasticity. We could say brain, mind, and behavioral plasticity. So plasticity, we often think as neuroscientists, we're only talking about neuroplasticity. And indeed, things look very compelling when we look at markers of neuroplasticity. You can see this schematic from an impactful paper in Cell a couple of years ago now, looking at different components of synaptogenesis, spine density growth. So the communicative parts of neurons anatomically growing with exposure to different psychedelic compounds. But we could look at other markers. This is an older study looking at BDNF as a marker of neuroplasticity. I present this one because the effect is especially marked in the cortex and less so in hippocampal regions. In fact, a decrease in the dentate gyrus there. So given the high expression of 2A receptors in the cortex, it stands to reason that the plasticity might be especially pronounced in the cortex. And indeed, that's what we're seeing here. Here's a more recent study looking in vivo at spine density increases. And again, those being quite marked with psilocybin. And the important point with this recent data is that the effect is enduring. It's there out even at day 34 post-exposure. So a quite rapid and enduring increase in neuroplasticity in vivo with psilocybin. Then this connection with neuroplasticity makes sense if you look at, first of all, the association between serotonin and brain development, which is very strong, is well established, but also 2A specifically. And one finding that has really excited me in recent years is this one from Wieland Hüttner's lab at Max Planck, which has found an association between serotonin 2A receptor signaling in the embryo brain and the proliferation of basal progenitor cells, the cells that go on to become neurons. And the proliferation of these cells is what is required for the huge expansion of neurons that you see in the human species. And indeed, the authors make that link in the abstract of the paper published in Neuron. So very exciting evidence to link 2A serotonin 2A receptor signaling, the receptors that are hijacked by psychedelics, with brain growth, with cortical growth and interspecies differences there. That's not to say that psychedelics will grow the brain, but some involvement in 2A signaling and brain growth. So that's the connection. We could also look at learning, different aspects of learning. Yes, this is low-level learning, associative learning, classical conditioning type learning, both aversive and aversive in particular. This slide is a nice one looking at some old data, oldish, looking at aversive learning in rabbits and that being accelerated, the learning rate being accelerated with exposure to LSD and slowed down with a 2A blocker. You put in the 2A blocker in LSD and you get a normalized response there. So it's 2A and learning is one other connection that links 2A signaling to plasticity. And we can also look at cognitive flexibility and some recent evidence of post-acute. So after the experience, increases in reversal learning linked to 2A signaling. We can look upper level still, psychological flexibility, a construct linked to certain schools of psychotherapy, such as acceptance and commitment therapy, the ability to sit with challenging emotions and memories, work through them rather than seek to avoid them, is the principle that we're talking about here with psychological flexibility, and some growing evidence now of increases in that, again, post-acutely with psychedelics. So how do we frame all this? Well, this is a slide that speaks to that, which is essentially showing that the conditions that will upregulate 2A receptor functioning are conditions of adversity, of stress. And so a background of chronic stress with a variety of different stresses appear to upregulate the 2A receptor system, whether it's increasing the levels of the density of the receptors themselves or their sensitivity to some readout of 2A signaling. Now, if you provide on top of that background of chronic stress, acute stress, then I'm suggesting you have a kind of tinderbox situation there with the primed 2A system, the system hijacked by psychedelics, and then the acute stress being the most reliable way to release the endogenous ligand serotonin itself onto that primed system, here with tail pinch, handling, swim stress, and a big spike in serotonin release there. So the context I'm trying to set here is that the natural system, in a sense, that psychedelics hijack as drugs, hijacking the brain and body, is one that engages during adversity. Why does it do that? It promotes plasticity. Plasticity links with adaptability. You're essentially moving the species into the organism into a mode of heightened adaptability given that adversity. So that for me is a plausible evolutionary functional explanation for why the 2A receptor exists, what it does. And I think that's a useful framework for thinking of psychedelics. Again, these drugs that hijack this natural plasticity system. And I framed it in this way with this term pivotal mental states, which I define as states of transient hyperplasticity in which outcomes are critically dependent on the context in which that plasticity occurs. If the context is adverse, then you could imagine a plastic being pulled towards pathology. This is a harsh, unpleasant environment, and I'm mopping it all up, and that could translate into something like, PTSD or psychosis, for example. But imagine another scenario: you induce a state, or a state of hyperplasticity occurs. The environment is supportive. It's enriched. It's therapeutically designed, and someone could pivot perhaps away from pathology towards relative wellness. And I'm suggesting that is essentially the model with psychedelic therapy. It's harnessing a more basic plasticity with therapeutic intent and purpose. And I think if you look at the modern literature that's backing psychedelic therapy, it's easy to infer that from the design of these studies. All of the studies have manipulated context in a positive way, with therapeutic support before, during, and after, music listening across the board. And the improvements are impressive. They appear rapidly. They appear to be quite enduring. And they also appear to apply across diagnostic categories. And these are really the reasons why people are getting excited about psychedelic therapy, that, these are big pluses when we compare them with other treatments, whether they're drug treatments or psychotherapy, with a lag of treatment onset, a requirement for repeat administration, whether that's taking the drug every day or psychotherapy for, weeks and months on end. And then that transdiagnostic action, of course, is very appealing, and it opens up this tantalizing possibility that seems very plausible, that it makes a lot of sense on a number of levels, that there could be a kind of common denominator or shared space across diagnostic boundaries that's being targeted by this treatment modality. And others have talked about this in different ways. I call them maladaptive habits or biases of mind and or behavior. And you can think of multiple examples, whether they are those we'd associate with depression, like the negative cognitive bias in depression, or specific anxiety disorders, or specific addictions, where clearly there are certain habits in behavior and association that become stamped in. So with the psychedelic, you have that window of opportunity, that window of plasticity, that with psychedelic therapy, critically a combination treatment, you're trying to, harness, exploit that window of opportunity for therapeutic ends. So these slides I present to introduce briefly the brain imaging data that we have looking at the action of psychedelics on brain function. Here we are looking at an increase in communication across systems in the brain that ordinarily speak much more within their own systems. So, for example, other visual regions speaking just to other visual regions. Throw in psilocybin, a classic psychedelic found in so-called magic mushrooms, and the communication is much more widespread across systems in the brain. This is the acute action of the drug. We've seen it with psilocybin, we've seen it with LSD. in a slightly different way. We've seen it with DMT and other classic psychedelic. And we've also drilled down into this action where we've looked at it more dynamically. So rather than averaging across a period, what if we look at sub-periods within a longer period? When we do that, we actually get a clearer picture of what's going on. We see that under the psychedelic, this globally coherent brain state, where all the different regions are essentially fluctuating in their spontaneous activity in a synchronous way, in a phase-locked way, more under the psychedelic. And certain systems that are high level, that are actually those systems that house the 2A receptor very densely, are those systems that drop away, they diminish, they're not visited as much under the psychedelic. So we could look at a pattern like this and infer something wrong, which is that this pattern sort of dominates under the psychedelic. These are high-level transmodal association regions housing the 2A receptor. The reality is actually they diminish, they drop away. So while they're increasing in global brain functional connectivity, their boundaries, if you want, are breaking down. And in related data sets, we've seen this effect, this increase in global brain function and the breaking down of the boundaries of these high-level systems is correlating with some of the high-level aspects of the psychedelic experience, specifically ego dissolution, that sense, or that highly unusual experience, a breakdown of ego boundaries, perceived boundaries between self and others and self and world. This breakdown in modularity that we see under psychedelics, we're actually also seeing subacutely after the psychedelic in our depression trials. And it seems to be a good effect. It seems to correlate with the treatment outcomes. Here we see it 1 day post-treatment in our treatment-resistant depression trial. The effect correlates with improvements in depressive symptom severity. And here we're seeing it in our more recent New England Journal of Medicine major depressive disorder trial. Again, same effect correlating with treatment improvements, and also potentially selective to the psilocybin intervention. We did not see it with a conventional antidepressant treatment, the SSRI escitalopram, 6 weeks of that. So how do we make sense of all of this? This is a busy slide, and the point I try to make when presenting it is link up these patterns, and we can do that formally and have begun to do that. But otherwise, let me just sort of speak to the apparent overlap. First of all, we have the 2A receptor, highly expressed in high-level transmodal association cortex. We can look at brain evolution, macaque to human, and what we're plotting here with the hot colors is where in the brain is the expansion greatest. It's in the high-level transmodal association cortex. The 2A receptors are densely expressed. Makes sense of that. The paper early on, linking 2A signaling to proliferation of basal progenitor cells and the growth of the cortex itself. It makes a lot of sense. We can also look at expansion of the brain within a lifetime, babies up to adults, and again, similar maps here. We can look at passing up the functional connectivity of the human brain and how that naturally falls in along a gradient that separates high-level transmodal cortex from unimodal, more modular-specific, function-specific cortex, like the visual cortex and motor cortex. We can look at longer fibers, evidence of longer fibers in this same pattern. I'll call it the human system from here on, given that it is associated with brain that is expanded most in our species. Higher variability in this system, a more plastic system related to that, lighter myelination in this system, the processing of more abstract information, longer temporal windows, a faster type of metabolism, aerobic glycolysis, and the action of psychedelics being implicated in this system. So the point being that psychedelics target this high-level aspect of brain and break it down transiently under the drug, and actually that action, that acute action, may also relate to its therapeutic action. Now, Rebus is a model I introduced couple of years ago with Carl Fristen's help and harnessing his, say, unrivaled theoretical and empirical work around hierarchical predictive processing. And the principle is that under psychedelics, the hypothesis is that there is a relaxation or a decrease in the precision weighting of priors. What does that mean in English? It's the relaxation of confidence in our beliefs or assumptions about things, multiple levels, perceptual or higher level cognitive. And so that's the model. These are just slides that speak to our brains being inference machines, experiencing the world in a way that's dominated by our internal models, experiencing the world through our internal models. You might look at something like this and see motion because you're experiencing this optical illusion through your internal predictive model, and you predict that there's motion and there isn't any motion, yet you hallucinate it because you're experiencing it through that model. Here it's now becoming a commodity of sorts. So how can we test this idea of a relaxation of precision weighting in priors? Well, one way to do it is to look at candidates of how these predictive mechanisms are encoded in brain function, and cortical traveling waves are a particularly hot candidate. We can look at it simply with EEG and simple EEG devices that will record across a hierarchy. The hierarchy we're looking at here is a one that runs from the low end, the visual cortex at the back of the brain, up to the high end, the frontal cortex. And if you look at a very simple paradigm of eyes closed, eyes open, with eyes open, the information flow flips to bottom up because you're processing information that travels up the hierarchy. And with eyes closed, the directionality is top down, nothing to see here. So we predicted that if you threw a psychedelic into the mix here, IV, DMT, rapid acting, we'd see a flip in the direction of the traveling waves, akin to what you see when someone opens their eyes and actually processes incoming visual information. And that's what we saw in a very compelling way. The backward waves dropping down and the forward waves increasing in line with the peak intensity of the DMT experience. Very, very similar to what you see with simply opening your eyes. This effect correlated with the intensity of the subjective experience, the altered state of consciousness with DMT. It also makes sense as a model in relation to a number of different aspects of the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience, things dropping away, ego dissolution, a particularly central or deep predictive model that I am this person, I'm Robin Carhart Harris, and so on, but that dropping away under the psychedelic, any confidence in that being an absolute phenomenon in the universe. And then as something drops away, something can percolate up, and visions and emotions that emerge under the psychedelic being examples of that. So that's the model. And does it make sense of the therapeutic mechanisms? I would suggest that maybe it does. Related to the therapeutic work, our recent trial was a comparison, a double-blind randomized controlled trial comparing psilocybin therapy with 6 weeks of escitalopram. The design was a little more complicated than that because we tried to balance for different aspects of the two conditions. So, for example, in the psilocybin arm, people took placebo capsules every day for balancing, controlling for the action of taking a capsule every day. And in the escitalopram arm, people had a very, very low dose of psilocybin in a treatment session, and all the psychological trappings that we have around psychedelic therapy. They had 2 low-dose sessions. So it was a tough test, a good test, I think, for psilocybin, and the outcomes were quite promising. These are confidence intervals when they pass the midline. They all favor a condition with greater than 95% confidence. That was true of 3 of 4 rating scales and all of these other major efficacy outcome measures. The one that didn't hit was the primary outcome measure. So that, in keeping with good practice, dominated the narrative of the paper. Is it the truth? Well, truth. I would say look at the data and you can make your inferences there. But I think we reported the paper in a very conservative and disciplined way, put it that way. The onset was more rapid in terms of the improvements in mental health outcomes with psilocybin and the escitalopram, just watching the time here. Now, most recently, I'll end on this, but most recently we were encouraged to split the sample by those who discontinued SSRIs when they came into the trial. Some people didn't, they just weren't on meds. They came in, coin was flipped, and they either got escitalopram or psilocybin. And 2/3 of the sample, didn't discontinue anything, and 1/3 did come off their meds, their conventional antidepressants, to come into the trial. Now, I stress this because it had a major effect on the outcomes. The majority that didn't discontinue, if we only looked at them, every outcome measure would significantly favor psilocybin, including the primary that was the only one that didn't hit. And but look at it another way. What about the minority who did discontinue? Well, nothing would have separated in favor of psilocybin. Something is going on with discontinuation. And what we find is that it affects both conditions. If anything, it affected the SSRI condition even more. If you come off meds and go back on them, you do well. You do as well as if you got psilocybin. There's no difference. And if you come off meds and come in and get psilocybin, the therapeutic effects are attenuated. So you could word it this way: you take a fresh brain and body without a recent background of SSRI use, the outcomes are going to massively favor psilocybin. But you take a medicated brain and body with a medication that you're going to go back onto, and it diminishes any difference between the two conditions. Of course, there's a lot of potential explanations for this effect, but what I'm telling you is the effect. So more research to be done there. It seems to be an important phenomenon. So I'd just like to thank you all for listening again. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks to the Imperial team and those who've made this research possible. Almost entirely philanthropic support. Now, my team, small team but growing at Neuroscape, and also a list of some disclosures there as well. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Robin, for a fantastic and interesting talk on what is a very emerging hot topic and also somewhat controversial. And today we're fortunate enough to be able to have a panel discussion around the talk. And I've had a look at some of the comments in the Q&A box, which I'll try and incorporate into that panel discussion. Joining us for that panel discussion is Wayne Hall, who I'm sure probably needs no introduction. Wayne is an emeritus professor at the University of Queensland. He used to be our director at NDARC a long time ago. He's one of the most prolific authors in the field, and he has a particular interest in neuroethics, addiction neuroethics. He did his PhD back in the 1970s, so he's got firsthand experience, historical experience of what LSD and other psychedelics can do, and I think it would be great to learn from that experience. We're also joined by Dr. Nadine Ezard, who's the clinical director at the St. Vincent's Drug and Alcohol Services, which incorporates the stimulant treatment program, and Jonathan Brett, who is actually conducting, I think, one of the only trials of psilocybin for methamphetamine dependence in Australia. So be very keen, and he's a clinical toxicological pharmacologist and addiction medicine specialist, but basically a real life clinician at St. Vincent's Hospital who deals with people who use drugs. So it'd be great to have your insights into this as well, Jonathan. But I want to start with a question for you, Robin. One of the things that came up in the Q&A chat, and which I also am curious about, is the role of psychotherapeutic process in this therapy. I mean, my understanding is it's not just a pharmacological process here, but there's also a psychoanalytic process that goes on. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about the psychotherapy that happens in conjunction with this treatment?
Sure, happy to. The first thing to say is that psychedelic, the etymology of the term means psyche revealing, or to make manifest the psyche, or soul is the most literal translation. And so it was a conversation between Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond where they came up with this term, and really those two individuals were trying to communicate to people that a key property of these compounds is that they reveal to the experiencer aspects of the psyche, the mind, if you want, that are ordinarily not so clearly visible. And so that speaks to psychoanalytic principles in terms of aspects of mind that aren't fully conscious. And these are drugs that can enable the emergence of, say, unconscious material, to use psychoanalytic terminology, into conscious awareness. And maybe because of the culture of the time, psychoanalytic psychotherapy was more dominant. And in the 50s and 60s, that really dominated the use of psychedelics in psychiatric work. When we do our modern research, with some mentorship and learning from those who came before us, doing psychedelic therapy in the 50s and 60s, the key aspects of the approach you could define as threefold. There's the preparation, building rapport and a good therapeutic relationship ahead of the experience, likely some priming effects there that are likely to play a major role, but also just support. And then the supervised session itself, which typically, at least in our research, is somewhat passive. The individual lies with often eye shades on, listens to music, and there isn't that much intervention. There might be reassurance every now and again. And then the third component is what we call integration, which is, in a sense, processing the experience afterwards. Teams differ on how much integration work they do. In a psychoanalytic sense, you might say that the integration is a long-term project. But in a trial, you might have, say, two or three integration sessions after an experience.
And these are quite lengthy, I understand. I'm just trying to get a handle on the practicalities. And it's a little bit different, I guess, than the opioid agonist therapy model that we have for heroin use. And I'm just wondering, maybe Nadine, if you are familiar with this, whether you have any thoughts on like how this would sit within the type of clinical service that you would run. And
yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I'm glad that you've kind of phrased it in that way, because I've been thinking about this in two ways, not just, Back to the Future and, resurgence of interest in psychedelics more generally, but perhaps also as a reaction to our drift away from providing genuine psychotherapeutic treatment to many of our clients. So the way that opioid agonist therapy is delivered for a while there was just get the drug into people and don't bother talking to them. And so this is a chance to kind of reshape that into actually talking about what's going on for people inside their worlds. Not taking into consideration as well the whole structural component of why people might end up in treatment for opioid agonist therapy. So this is certainly a piece that we're missing in the sense of how best to engage people in psychotherapeutic change. I guess the other question that comes up to us when we talk with our clients about the potential of psychedelic kind of interventions is, but I've already had magic mushrooms, or I've used acid and it makes no difference. So it really is this emphasis on psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, which, I mean, maybe Jonathan can talk to, that it's much de-emphasizing the psychopharmacological properties of psychedelic medications, but using them to have a kind of a truncated or compressed psychotherapeutic approach. And so it's the psychotherapeutic assisted aspect that I'm pretty excited in the kind of work that Jonathan's designing. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a bit, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Nadine. Completely agree. I mean, I don't have a lot to add there, really. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my talk after the panel discussion. But just to say, I agree. Everyone's excited because this is potentially a real synergy between psychotherapy and pharmacology, which is historically sat in different camps and been a little siloed in the past, and so. In thinking about this, it's really important to think about how we frame to patients and to the general public about how this is. And in saying, what you just said about past psychedelic experiences, I think it's really important to get that across. And also, I think, one thing that struck me through this whole process is it still requires a lot of work from the participant, from the person who's actually undergoing this. It's not a passive process, so I think that was it's kind of an interesting thing to emphasize as well. It's not always easy.
I mean, if I can throw it in, just a question that did actually come up in the Q&A box. I mean, how do you avoid a bad trip, and how does this interact with all the other substances that people are using? I mean, if we were to apply something like this in the addictions field, what kind of hazards could we expect? What would be a good therapeutic environment? How do you avoid these problems?
Yeah, well, in a sense, avoidance is a defense mechanism. The preparation ahead of the session is to talk about, we use phrases like in and through, borrowed from mentorship ahead of our work. But the principle is one of working with psychological challenges. In many cases, if say we're looking at depression or addictions, you'll find a history of adverse, experiences, whether in childhood or later, and so that's often the material that comes up, and as it comes up, you don't promote an avoidance, you promote an openness, an exploration, a willingness to process, and if done in the in an ideally supportive environment with trust and aftercare, then that can work very well.
Wayne, perhaps you've got some contribution from your experience, particularly from the historical application, because it's not the first round of psychedelic research that's happened, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, the earliest form of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy was AA. That's what Humphrey Osmond and Abraham Hoffman in Calgary practice. They saw LSD as a way of introducing people to AA, and they saw the active therapy being the engagement with the fellowship after their sessions in treatment. I guess the other thing, having, as you said, sort of being chronologically gifted enough to have lived through the late 60s and early 70s, these sorts of drugs were everywhere when I was doing my higher degree. And I saw a lot of people do very crazy things using these drugs. Very intelligent people, I should say. They were sort of people doing doctoral degrees and postdoctoral and so on. And I guess that's the downside, that, I mean, when used in a therapeutic context, they can certainly be used to help people address the sorts of issues that Robin has described. But there also have potential for misuse and the history of cults that are formed around these drugs in the way in which they can be used, which I think is a concern, particularly if they get out into the wild. And I think we're seeing some resurgence of interest, the decriminalised nature movement in the US wanting to legalise the use of psilocybin or the mushrooms, ayahuasca, which contains DMT, and peyote. The extent to which these sorts of substances can get out into the wild, and not just into the wild. I mean, there was a cult in Australia called The Family, which was run by a woman who I think was probably psychotic, who kidnapped and abducted children and convinced her followers that she was a reincarnation of Jesus Christ. That was done with LSD that was prescribed by a psychiatrist who was part of the cult. So I think there is that sort of risk that needs to be addressed in the way in which these things are used.
Wayne, I'm curious, like you say, it was originally used for AA, and I know that there was some research at the time. Why didn't it take off then? Like, what stopped it?
I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I think Osmond and Humphrey, who were the main advocates for the treatment, were certainly making very strong claims for it. And there was, I think, an understandable skepticism about that. And I mean, I share that to a degree. And having been around when SSRIs came in, we heard a lot of the same sort of hype about those drugs back then that we're hearing to a degree around psychedelics now. And although they clearly have a place in the treatment of depression, they're much more incremental in their effect rather than the transformative psychopharmacology that people thought they might be. So I think those are concerns, and I think that happened with Osmond and Humphrey. And it's certainly the case that research on these drugs continued a lot longer than people often imagine. They were going on in Maryland until the late 1970s. And the group that were doing trials there were reporting reasonably positive results, but nowhere near as positive as the sorts of claims made initially. And I think that's always the case with new treatments, that the people who introduce them are enthusiastic about them. They recruit people who are open to experiment and use new treatments. When you start seeing treatments used in ordinary clinical practice on unselected patients, the results often don't look quite as dramatic.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've seen it, unfortunately, with many new therapeutics. And I'm just wondering, in that context, I mean, the evaluation of this, I imagine, must be quite complicated because it's a very intensive treatment. I mean, Robin, how do you adjust for the fact that people are undergoing psychotherapy? I mean, what controls can you put in place to ensure that the benefits are there from the psilocybin as opposed to the broader therapeutic process, or just that patient engagement? How do you control for that?
I guess you control for the psychotherapy to look at the pharmacology by having psychotherapy in the other arm. But I do want to emphasize that the approach that we're taking, which I think is the dominant approach, is to view psychedelic therapy as a combination treatment. The therapeutic effects and the safety profile is positive when you look at the two in combination. You take the drug out of that therapeutic context and you have the potential for the kind of abuse that Professor Hall was referring to. So in a sense, the point is to take this kind of out of the wild, which is where it is now and has been for a while, and bring it more into the clinic. Yeah.
I mean, Jonathan, you've been evaluating this in the context of methamphetamine use in Australia. What practical challenges have you hit in trying to evaluate it?
I suppose there's a number of aspects. I mean, one category would be, just logistically and setting it up and getting all the sort of institutional and, Commonwealth and state approvals to do it, given it was one of the first. And then there's sort of conceptual challenges around how you actually design this kind of study and what you focus on. And, I'm sure everyone's aware that there's been a recent sort of grant round for MRFF and lots of activity around thinking about trial design for psychedelics. And so, there's a number of challenges in my mind, like, choice of control. There's a lot of kind of variables that could be varied within the package that is psychedelic psychotherapy. So, there's the dose of the psychedelic, there's a number of dosing sessions, there's the dose of psychotherapy, I suppose, if you like, and there's the modality of psychotherapy or the framework that's used, which is sort of broadly similar across trials, but there are some variations as well. So, I think there's some practical challenges and there's some conceptual challenges in setting up the trials as well. So it's still a learning curve for me. But it's been a really interesting experience thinking about all of this stuff.
I mean, definitely with any pharmaceutical treatment that we put into place, even if it is combined with psychotherapy, it has to pass muster in terms of being safe and effective. And I think that is one of the real challenges for this to know that if we're going to be doing a very intensive psychotherapy, that it is safe and effective, and it is better than simply doing the psychotherapy on its own or giving another treatment. But we are out of time, so I'm sorry we can't keep discussing this, but we have lots of exciting presentations coming up, and I'd just like to thank the panel for your contribution today, and particularly for Robin for presenting on your research. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Michael now. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And Robin, thank you very much for that fascinating presentation and the exploration of the research potential of this area and the capacity to develop it further. And congratulations on your contribution to the field. So with that, I hand over to Jonathan Brett, Dr. Jonathan Brett, who's going to talk on the PRISMA trial of psilocybin for methamphetamine use disorder. Jonathan, you've been introduced already, so I'll let you fire ahead.
Great, thank you, Michael. And thanks, Robin, for a really great talk. And I think it sets the scene for a lot of what I'm going to talk about. I'm in the really fortunate and exciting position of being able to talk to you about this study, which is actually, as far as I'm aware, the first in the world psychedelic psychotherapy study to look at methamphetamine use disorder, although there are a number of other groups in the US that have already started down this path as well. So when talking about psychedelic psychotherapy, it's really hard not to wander into metaphors, but I think they can be useful, and there's many to describe it. But one that I like to think about, because I like mountains, is thinking about this and really emphasizing this collaboration between the therapist and the patient to in the context of a drug to get up a mountain so you can get to the top and see the beautiful views, whether that's a sunrise or whatever. And there's a number of aspects of this really in terms of it's a collaborative process, it's a synergy between the drug and the therapist, but also it's hard work, and the work needs to be done by both the therapist and the patient to get to the top to see the views. So I'm not going to linger too much on this, but just to say there are a range of psychedelics out there, and there are a range of psychedelics that have been used both recreationally and in the context of clinical trials. I'm going to focus on psilocybin here, but just to cover off the fact that there are a number of others that have really already been mentioned. The classic psychedelics there tend to act on 5-HT system, 2A predominantly. You've got dissociatives there that predominantly act as an NMDA receptor antagonists, so ketamine and phencyclidine. So ketamine, as you're probably aware, has shown a lot of promise in treatment of depression. And MDMA kind of vaguely falls within the psychedelic category, but has a quite a different sort of psychotherapeutic intervention and indications when thinking about this in a sort of therapeutic context. So I won't linger on this because I think Robin's really covered this much better than this basic slide could. But just to say that, these psychedelics, I'm going to focus on psilocybin really, but talk a little bit about LSD. Mostly act on the 5-HT receptor, but probably act on a number of other 5-HT receptors as well, plus possibly other receptors. And I mean, the pharmacology is really interesting, and we are learning more about it as we go, but it seems like psilocybin is a partial agonist, and there may be some bias agonism as well, which may explain, the differential effects of different psilocybin, different serotonin ligands on the serotonin receptor. So psilocybin, I mean, just to say that it's been around for an awfully long time, and its history with humanity is also fairly well documented. even back to these ancient stone sculptures there, 500,000 BC. I believe that was from Latin America. There's over 200 species of naturally occurring psilocybin mushrooms. So the dose of psilocybin that's been used in most trials is 25 milligrams, although a number of other doses have been studied. And there does seem to be, across some aspects, some measures, a degree of linearity in dose-response relationships, although it remains a little unclear. So it's actually metabolized to psilocin, which is the active compound, and then it's further metabolized by monoamine oxidases. So half-life typically 160 minutes of psilocybin, then 50 minutes for psilocin, but you get a duration of effect of about 4 to 8 hours. Now, why psilocybin rather than LSD? Both have been studied in the past, but there's some aspects of psilocybin that may make it slightly easier to work with in the therapeutic context. That being that it has a slightly shorter time to peak effect, and a slightly shorter duration of effect. So you really, you're not sitting for hours and hours in a therapy space with a person who's having a very lengthy psychedelic experience that may even be rather challenging. So that's why psilocybin seems to be the focus of interest in many studies. So just to review a little of what's going on in the sort of addiction space for psychedelics. As we were mentioning, a lot of the research was actually done in the 60s, 70s, before all of that was shut down. And so there's a few articles from there and some more recent research as well. Just to say that it's really in the very early stages. In fact, most studies that have been done to date, most recent studies are either phase 1 or phase 2. So just to sort of summarize, there's a meta-analysis of studies looking at LSD for alcohol dependence. And really, just to summarize that, that showed that there was a really good response in the first couple of months that was sustained to about 6 months, but seen to wane at about a year. But most of the studies from that meta-analysis were actually published in the 70s, where treatment for alcohol dependence was quite different, very different contexts. So I think that definitely needs to be thought about again in the current sort of treatment paradigm. Again, the more recent study for alcohol was done by Bogenschutz, who's based in New Mexico, I believe, and that was his initial study was a pilot study, open label of 10 people, which showed their pretty dramatic reduction in percentage drinking days and percentage heavy drinking days. There was another older study looking at people who are in residential rehab for opioid dependence, and again, quite a dramatic difference between treatment and controls there with LSD psychotherapy. And there was another more recent open-labeled study looking at nicotine dependence, following up for 6, 12, and then greater than 16 months, that showed a really quite a dramatic response and maintenance of abstinence there as well. So it's a rapidly expanding space, and there are a number of other things in progress with addictions. And really, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's just to sort of name a significant few. So actually, Bogenschutz, who published the open label study in alcohol, is, I believe, just about to publish the results, positive results of a phase 3 study for psilocybin psychotherapy for alcohol dependence. There's a group in Wisconsin that are just about to start recruiting, or have started recruiting, for a safety feasibility study of psilocybin psychotherapy in an opioid substitution population, predominantly buprenorphine, and they're also about to, just about to start the process of a study for psilocybin psychotherapy for methamphetamine dependence. There's a group in Alabama led by Peter Hendricks, who've just completed phase 2 trial for psilocybin psychotherapy for cocaine dependence, with very positive results, I hear. And University of Baltimore still recruiting phase 2 smoking cessation study. And as I said, there's probably a lot more going on, but these are the sort of main ones that I'm aware of. The exciting thing is there's a lot going on in Australia, and it continues to grow. So in St. Vincent's, Melbourne, there's a psychedelic psychotherapy study for cancer-related anxiety led by Mark Ross, and a study for treatment-resistant depression, generalized anxiety. And in St. Vincent's, Sydney, there's the study for methamphetamine use disorder, which I'm the PI on, and another treatment-resistant depression study, which is going on, sponsored by the Black Dog Institute. And as I said, we are imminently going to hear about the MRFF results, which gave $15 million for psychedelic psychotherapy research. So there's a lot of people on the edge of their seats at the moment. So Robin's already talked a bit about the rationale for psychedelic psychotherapy, but just to say that it doesn't really bear to mention there's a large treatment need for methamphetamine use disorder. There's 1.3 million people in Australia living with this. About a third experience very high levels of distress, and it's accompanied by a whole range of burden of disease as well. In terms of how to frame this, people with methamphetamine use disorder, and it could be any addiction or mood disorder there in the middle, often experience social disconnection, decreases in mental flexibility, ruminations, so really repetitive thoughts about themselves and often negative thoughts about the world, and often a decreased ability to mentalize, so a decreased ability to put themselves in other people's shoes. And you'll see, and probably already sort of caught on from Robin's talk, that psychedelic psychotherapy can address a lot of these issues. From existing evidence for some indications, there's a large and early evidence, there's a large and rapid response. Therapy happened, this package of treatment happens over a limited time frame. And in the therapeutic setting and in research setting, it's been overwhelmingly safe so far. And just to emphasize, look, it appears that this is possibly a transdiagnostic therapy. And this therapy may cause us to rethink actually our diagnostic categories and how we think about diagnoses in mental health and addiction, much more along the lines of cancer therapy, thinking about cancer as a sort of molecular thing, rather than DSM classification. So there's lots of descriptions of the phenomenology of psychedelics, but this is one that I particularly like, and you can see here the psychedelic experience, is one of often one of deep connection, deeply positive mood, and intuitive knowledge. And you can, from the experience of addiction, you can see how that might be helpful. Again, there's a lot of focus on the default mode network in addiction now. We used to think, a lot of focus historically was on the limbic circuit, how that was hijacked, but now we're sort of realizing more that there's a lot more networks that are really important in addiction. And I won't labor the point here because I think Robin covered it really much better than I could. But it's really to say that aspects of disorder in the default mode network in addiction can lead to emotional dysregulation, low self-esteem, rumination, self-referential thoughts, and decreased ability to mentalize. And then, in the context of psilocybin, you really have, an amelioration of a lot of these issues. Increased connectivity to other brain areas is the key thing, but a change in the activity of the default mode network may mediate some of the positive effects as well. Again, there's a lot of focus on neuroplasticity, inflammation, and biomarkers, and we know in addiction these are really important aspects as well. Addiction, there's some evidence that psychostimulants and it's actually addiction in general is neuroinflammatory, and there's particular neuroinflammatory pathways that have been found to be possibly important in possibly sort of mediating ongoing addictive behaviors. I think this is really focusing on a brain model of addiction. Really want to emphasize that this is in the context of everything else in people's lives as well. So what does it look like? We've already covered this off a little. So the study personnel is really important, and generally the therapy is delivered by a dyad. So it's two therapists seeing the patient together, and there's a number of reasons I can touch on that in questions if anyone's interested. But as Robin was saying, the setting in which it's delivered is really important. So it's very important for people to feel comfortable and safe for this to be a conducive therapeutic environment, because people are very vulnerable and suggestible to aspects of their environment, and that can really affect their experience. So generally there's preparation that goes on. A lot of that's developing therapeutic alliance, helping people feel safe, and really setting an intention of what people want to get out of the session and preparing them for the psychedelic experience. We really don't have a sense of, what dose of psychotherapy or what modality is best to use. In addiction, it's mostly been a cocktail of motivational interviewing and ACT, but we don't really know what the best one is there. Then you have your psychedelic dose. In general, people stay for 8 hours during that session with the dyad. There's a range of doses been given in the past, but 25 milligrams is the commonest of psilocybin. And then you have a number of psychedelic psychotherapy sessions afterwards to integrate your experience of making sense of what happened, planning for next steps. And again, we don't know what the best modality and dose of that is really. So what's SIMAR? So it's an open label pilot study, and it's really looking at safety feasibility, aiming to recruit 15 people with methamphetamine use disorder. We've taken a number of steps to try and reduce the risk of psychosis, even though I can talk more about that if anyone's interested, even though I think it's probably a different phenomenon to what actually happens during a psychedelic experience. As I said, safety feasibility, but we've been looking at a number of other secondary outcomes, including methamphetamine use, other drug use, cravings, quality of life, psychiatric comorbidities, and we'll be doing some brain imaging before and after and biomarkers. So this is what the study looks like. We've got very rigorous screening, so they undergo 3 screening visits to make sure that we've really met the eligibility criteria. Then we do a qualitative interview, do a resting states MRI, and do some look at some biomarkers. Then we do the prep psychotherapy, dosing day, and then follow up over 3 months from the dosing day. So my reflections on this process, it was remarkably easy to get institutional approvals. St Vincent's Melbourne had already done the hard work for us, and actually were very well supported by the St Vincent's network for this work, because it's quite in line with their philosophy. It was surprisingly easy to get this through Human Research Ethics Committee with some groundwork, yeah, it was really quite a smooth process. As was actually applying for Schedule 9 permits and licenses. Actually importing the psilocybin was the harder part. There are very few companies that actually export and manufacture psilocybin, and they've recently been inundated with clinical trials. And I think that's why that's been the major bottleneck for our study, actually. But we're actually hoping to recruit starting sort of mid to late January next year. Everything else is in place apart from the drug. Just like to really thank all these investigators, really, again, Nadine for facilitating this at St Vincent's, Paul and Mark for being a massive help in setting this up, and Liz for being our lead therapist. NCRED really want to shout out because they've funded the study, and they've been really supportive, and St Vincent's Clinic, who also funded the imaging component of the study as well. So I think questions are at the end, but thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was a superb presentation, and that's a nice segue for me into introducing Professor Nadine Ezard, who's the director of both St. Vincent's Clinical Drug and Alcohol Service and the National Centre for Clinical Research in New and Emerging Drugs, which is a absolutely critical presence here for these presentations. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Nadine.
Thank you, Michael. Let me share my screen here. Great. All right. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here today. And thanks, Jonathan, for handing over to me. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Robin, for that fascinating talk. I'm just going to present a little bit on another clinical trial that we're running here at St Vincent's Hospital as one of the many sites with methamphetamine, but this time it's with a stimulant drug, with an agonist drug called lisdexamphetamine. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about where we're at and shift gear a little bit to talk about the implications of COVID on running that clinical trial. I'm speaking on behalf of our co-investigators. You can see that list there of investigators. I'd like to thank every one of them before we get going with this. And just by way of background for everyone here today, I'm sure you're aware that the increasing presentations for treatment for amphetamines in Australia has been going up pretty much in a straight line for the last decade. So we're now seeing a six-fold increase in presentations for methamphetamine use disorder treatment. That's gone from about 9% of all treatment episodes were for methamphetamine about 10 years ago. Now it's almost 30%, and second only to alcohol in this country. So we are seeing people coming forward for treatment. We don't have very much to offer them, unfortunately. So really the emphasis is on trying to get more treatments are available for us. Where our team, led by Krista, conducted a systematic review of where we're at with the pharmacological treatment, and there is, of course, no effective pharmacotherapy, but we felt, and the data suggests, that there are promising directions with what's called what we call agonist therapy, so stimulant drugs with similar properties to the drug that people are seeking treatment for. The rationale is that we can provide a safer dose, a confirmed dose with a pharmaceutical drug, perhaps a safer route of administration, or at least a slow onset route of administration with fewer adverse effects than an illegal drug that could potentially reduce withdrawal and craving, decrease the so-called positive reinforcing effects of using methamphetamine, and also provide a framework to provide access to regular healthcare and other psychosocial supports. We do have long experience now with off-label prescription of dexamphetamine. We at our clinic here, we've been doing it since 2006. We know it's feasible. We know people report reduced cravings and withdrawal. Previous RCTs, whilst they have shown improved retention, have not shown any change in methamphetamine use, although we do recognise that those studies were perhaps underpowered or underdosed. Enter onto the scene lisdexamphetamine, which was approved in Australia, I think, in around 2015 for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and later on for binge eating disorder. It's a prodrug of dexamphetamine, so it's hydrolyzed into dexamphetamine by the red blood cells. This property means that it has a slower onset of action than immediate release dexamphetamine. It doesn't have a faster onset of action if people crush it up and inject it, so there's no the regulatory framework through which this drug is delivered has less concern about misuse or on-selling of the drug. It's a once-day medication, and it has a slower onset and longer duration of action than dexamphetamine immediate release, which is what's available here in this country. Some of the other trials of dexamphetamine were with the slow release preparation, which is really, in fact, quite similar to lisdexamphetamine. Because we didn't know that at higher doses than are used for pediatric populations with ADHD would be safe in our population, we did trial this medication up to 250 milligrams a day as a dose escalation study with people who were using methamphetamine daily or second daily. We did not, because there is evidence of effectiveness of psychosocial interventions, particularly for people who are using less at baseline, we felt it was this more severely disordered population that the hope of a pharmaceutical intervention was most promising, and also potentially ethically, given the side effects of a high dose stimulant drug, to not provide a high dose stimulant to someone that wasn't already chronically exposed to a high dose stimulant drug. So we did do a pilot back in 2016, and we recruited 16 people, of whom 14 escalated to 250 milligrams a day. There was only one serious adverse event, and that was someone who expressed suicidal ideation following the final dose of the trial at the thought of not having any more of the medication. So that was resolved. All other adverse events were mild or moderate. And what we saw was some slight increase in heart rate by the end of week 4, when people reached the maximum dose of 250 milligrams, and blood pressure, just a slight increase too by the end of that peak. And when we looked at the group in total, there was a decrease in the median days of methamphetamine use, but this was not designed as an efficacy trial. It was just designed as a safety trial. So we felt there was sufficient evidence of safety to go on to the next phase, which was a multi-site randomized controlled trial called LIMA. And this is a study that's been conducted across 6 sites in Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia. It's a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled outpatient study where people get 12 weeks of 250 milligrams of lisdexamfetamine a day or placebo, with a 1-week induction and a 2-week reduction regimen. People are required to attend daily for the first 5 days, and then twice weekly for the remainder of the active intervention period, with 2 days supervised and 2 or 3 days takeaway medication, and 2 urine drug screens taken per week, with 1 selected at random for examination in the laboratory for confirmation of abstinence, self-reported abstinence from methamphetamine. Nevertheless, the primary outcome is self-reported efficacy of lisdexamfetamine in reducing methamphetamine use, and then a range of other secondary outcomes that you can see here. We're looking mental health and well-being, and cravings, withdrawal, and then 3 sub-studies, one looking at a new tool for measuring sexualized drug-taking behaviours in this population, as well as 2 other sub-studies looking at neurocognition and measurement of treatment outcomes. The primary endpoint was at the end of week 13, and people had very long, in addition to those 2 weekly visits, had very long visits once a month, and people were on study for 15 weeks with medication and 19 weeks of the trial altogether. However, COVID-19 in March 2020, the first wave for us here in Australia, resulted in a rapid pivot to protect the participant staff, and as a result of reorientation of the healthcare system and research effort towards much more pressing acute needs of COVID-19. The NHMRC released guidance in April of last year, which followed on from the US FDA guidance released a month earlier. And according to one survey of clinicaltrials.gov earlier this year, more than 2,000 clinical trials which had been registered were stopped. And we now have some consensus guidance on how to report trial modification due to COVID-19, that the conserve statement. And what happened for us in this trial across 6 sites is that we paused recruitment completely from March to November, and then restarted with quite a modified protocol. You'll see that we had 4 sites. We added another 2 sites prior to the COVID cessation. But this meant that we actually got up to recruiting 5 participants per month before COVID. And then after we restarted in November, we still managed to recruit 4 participants per month. We lost one of our sites, and we made important changes to the protocol in the new protocol after the restart that included decreasing from twice weekly to once weekly visits, permission for up to 14 days takeaway doses, a move to telehealth and telephone monitoring, and all the sub-studies were dropped. So that meant that the weight of surveillance decreased quite a lot, and has with it some implications that I'll discuss later. The other thing that we notice is that we have now recruited completely the baseline sample. There's 155 people have now been recruited. Before that pause of COVID, we recruited 118 and then 37 since. The sample before that was almost almost 60-40 male female. That's become slightly more male since then. I haven't tested this for significance. This is just a general observation at this stage. And the sample also, we had around 14% lesbian, gay, homosexual, and that's gone up to about 32% now, mainly men. So an increase, it looks like an increase in gay men have joined the trial since, and a decrease in people identifying as Aboriginality, as Aboriginal. So we'll have to take that into account when we do our analysis according to that conserve statement. The other thing that we noticed is that study retention looked like it was improved. So perhaps one of the benefits of the reduced surveillance following the restart is that we managed to retain people more. Previous to the COVID pause, we actually had lost almost half the people to follow up, and that retention is looking better. We haven't finished. We finished recruitment. The last person last visit is in December of this year, but it does raise the question around whether less. We do know in other trials, so for example, buprenorphine, that less frequent attendance can improve retention in pharmacotherapeutic studies. So maybe this is something we need to take into account as we're going forward with our studies post-COVID. And so I think I just wanted to pause here with the implications for us while we wait to wrap up the trial, but also what learnings we can take as we design interventions going forward post-COVID. And there's been quite some discussion around accelerating changes to the way we do study design and implementation, and that should not exclude substance use disorder treatment and should not exclude perhaps less supervision of the more tightly regulated medications such as Schedule 8 or even the Schedule 9 medications like psilocybin, and really looking at using remote monitoring and teletrials and the implications for that for our studies, with perhaps further investigation on what the implications would be for quality and validity. For many of our tools aren't designed for remote data collection. And I'll leave it there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadine, for that fascinating presentation of what I know has been many years of hard work. And so now we go over to Liam Etchison, who's a PhD student with NCRED, St. Vincent's and NDARC, and is presenting on the pilot work around the use of Lisdex for a methamphetamine withdrawal. Over to you, Liam.
Thank you so much, Michael, and to all the other wonderful speakers today. So today I'm going to be presenting our work on lisdexamphetamine for the treatment of methamphetamine withdrawal rather than dependence. This is definitely a work in progress. We're currently recruiting. So today I'll be presenting our protocol, what we're doing and how we're doing it, as well as some brief preliminary thoughts about how the trial's going. Before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge that I am presenting from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to acknowledge that the Gadigal people have occupied and cared for this country over countless generations, and we celebrate their continuing contribution to the life of the region. We know that the cessation or reduction in use of methamphetamine elicits a characteristic withdrawal syndrome, and ineffective treatment of withdrawal symptoms can lead to a relapse. Importantly, reduction in withdrawal symptoms or craving severity can lead to better treatment outcomes, but importantly, there is no evidence-based pharmacotherapy or psychotherapy for the management of methamphetamine withdrawal. Currently, the way that we approach it in a hospital setting is predominantly symptomatic, for example, using things like diazepam to manage anxiety. However, there's still no strong evidence base for this approach either. Previous studies have shown that agonist-like therapies, for example, dexamphetamine, have some limited efficacy around, as Nadine said, reductions in craving and withdrawal symptoms, but they still haven't shown any ability to reduce overall use. So for our study, we're looking at lisdexamphetamine, which is an inactive prodrug of dexamphetamine, and it's currently approved in Australia for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and binge eating disorder. Compared to dexamphetamine, Lisdex has a slower onset and causes lower peak dopamine concentrations in the brain. There's a longer duration of action and causes less positive reinforcing effects. And for these reasons, we feel like it's a really good candidate medication for this treatment. It has an agonist treatment effect. And for our study, we've proposed a tapering dose regime. We believe that using lisdexamphetamine in the acute withdrawal setting has the potential to attenuate the withdrawal symptoms while they're most strongest, usually during the first 5 to 7 days. It also has the potential to ameliorate dopaminergic downregulation, which is associated with methamphetamine withdrawal, as well as maybe help to reduce the cognitive dysfunction associated with the cessation of amphetamines. The way that we're testing this is through a single-arm, single-site clinical trial conducted at St Vincent's Hospital, Sydney, and we're doing it in a single-arm open-label style. We're looking to recruit 15 people with methamphetamine use disorder admitted to our inpatient withdrawal unit for the treatment of acute methamphetamine withdrawal, and we're treating them with lisdexamphetamine, starting at 250 milligrams and tapering over 5 days. The trial is being conducted through a 7-day inpatient admission with a 5-day treatment phase, followed by follow-up once a week for 3 weeks post-discharge. The primary outcomes of this study are safety and feasibility. And we're measuring safety through medical assessments, vital signs, as well as the type, number, and duration of adverse events. And feasibility is defined by the time taken to enroll the sample. We also have a few secondary outcomes, including acceptability, which are measuring through treatment satisfaction questionnaires and qualitative interviews, our ability to retain participants to the primary and secondary endpoints of the trial, any potential changes in withdrawal and cravings as measured by the amphetamine withdrawal questionnaire and visual analog scales, as well as some really novel investigation into the sleep-wake cycle of people going through withdrawal. And to do that, we're using sleep diaries as well as continuous actigraphy. We're recruiting people over the age of 18 years old who are presenting to inpatient drug treatment for methamphetamine withdrawal. They have to have been diagnosed with methamphetamine use disorder and have used really recently. We're also excluding people who are lactating, pregnant, or not willing to avoid becoming pregnant, and also people who have expected withdrawal from other drugs, excluding tobacco and cannabis. The way the trial is going to work, or is working, is recruitment is primarily through our hospital's centralized intake service, as well as through emergency department presentations. Participants are admitted to the hospital on what we call day 0. On this day, they're screened for eligibility, and if eligible, participants are enrolled in the clinical trial. This is also when we take our demographic and baseline measurements. Day 1 is then defined as the first day that a participant wakes up in the hospital, and that's when the medication started. Participants receive a tapering dose of the medication over the first 5 days of their admission, and safety and efficacy measures are conducted daily. This is with the exception of medical observations or vital signs, which are conducted 4 times a day. Our participants receive 250 milligrams of lisdexamphetamine on day 1, tapering by 50 milligrams per day until they receive 50 milligrams on day 5. Days 6 and 7 are optional, and participants do not receive any medication at this time. This is to give participants the option of discharging completely stimulant-free, which is often quite important to those going to residential rehab. And also, just in case we've pushed back some withdrawal symptoms, it allows us to manage those effectively. Participants will then be followed up by a telephone on days 14, 21, and 28 to discuss safety and engagement in care. To date, the project has been, we think, going quite well, and recruitment has been brisk. Since we opened recruitment earlier this year, we have managed to enroll 9 people in the trial. We recruited 7 people in less than 3 months before COVID, which was really great to see. However, once the COVID restrictions came in place, recruitment slowed quite significantly. However, we still managed to keep going with our recruitment, and we recruited a further 2 people during the current restrictions. In total, 33 potential participants have been pre-screened for this trial. And it's important to note at this point that there has been no active advertising for this study. Those pre-screened were those who were already seeking inpatient withdrawal or were admitted to the hospital through emergency department or our stimulant treatment program. And this is because it was a really small trial and we were worried that there might be a little bit more interest than we could manage. The most common reasons, however, why people did not progress to the formal screening for our trial were concurrent other drug use, notably alcohol and GHB, which we thought might precipitate withdrawal, as well as methamphetamine use not being recent enough to meet our inclusion criteria. Importantly, out of everybody we pre-screened for this trial, only 3 people were not interested in participating. And of those offered participation in the trial, a further 3 people declined to participate after we unfortunately had to inform them that tobacco smoking was not permitted in the withdrawal unit as it is a public hospital. We feel like these preliminary results indicate quite a need and a willingness in the community to participate in trials and find new treatments. And it also does display a significant, but also quite expected barrier to participation, which is the inability to smoke tobacco. Finally, I'd just like to finish with a small case report. And this is just to highlight the client experiences of withdrawal and participating in a clinical trial, as well as being able to demonstrate how engagement can be facilitated through clinical trial presentations. Our participant was a male in his 40s who presented to our emergency department in crisis, requesting a detox from methamphetamine. He regularly injected about ½ a gram of crystal methamphetamine twice a week, regularly for the last 8 years. But very importantly, he's never previously engaged with any treatment services before. We admitted him to the inpatient withdrawal unit overnight, where he was oriented to the study and gave his informed consent. We then screened him for participation and enrolled him in the study. He started his lisdexamfetamine the next morning as per protocol, and he was retained in the unit for 7 days as an inpatient. While he was admitted for the trial, a long-term publicly funded residential rehabilitation bed was facilitated for him, which was a great outcome, and we were able to discharge him directly from the unit to his rehab. Our participant then attended all follow-up visits from his rehab bed via telephone. He reported more mild, comfortable withdrawal than he was used to, and discharged with really good clinical outcomes and an ongoing treatment plan, which importantly was in line with the client's own personal goals. In conclusion, this is the first trial of lisdexamfetamine ever to be conducted for the treatment of methamphetamine withdrawal. If it's found to be safe and feasible, data from this trial will go towards informing fully powered randomized control trials, and only if proven effective in randomized control trials does lisdexamfetamine have the potential to become the first pharmacological treatment for methamphetamine withdrawal. I'd like to acknowledge the support of the entire study team, as well as the clinical staff from St. Vincent's Hospital Drug and Alcohol Service, but most importantly, our wonderful participants for giving up their time to participate in the study. The study is funded by NCRED, and I'm supported by NCRED, NDARC, and the Australian Government Research Training Program. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Liam, for that fascinating presentation and great work in keeping it going through COVID. I'll move straight over now to Nadine Ezard, who is going to provide us with an overview of some of her work on methamphetamine.
Hi, Michael. It's Rebecca here, actually. I hope that's okay. I'll gallop through this presentation because we are a little bit behind time. So today I want to talk about some findings from the NICE trial and some other recent research on pharmacotherapy for methamphetamine use. So firstly, the NICE trial. I want to acknowledge all of my colleagues who made this work possible. We had a multi-site trial with lots of investigators, but also our medical team all of the trial research team, DSMB, and various other people who contributed to this research, not to mention the participants who gave up their time and gave us their trust. So this is a trial of N-acetylcysteine, 2.4 grams per day over 12 weeks compared to placebo for methamphetamine dependence. The reason why we're looking at N-acetylcysteine is because N-acetylcysteine is thought to restore glutamate homeostasis, which is disrupted in addiction. It's been found to reduce craving for methamphetamine and various other drugs. And we wanted to find out whether that reduction in craving could translate to a reduction in methamphetamine use. And we measured that two ways, days of use and % of methamphetamine positive oral fluid samples. Our secondary outcomes were craving, severity of dependence, withdrawal. We also looked at psychiatric symptoms because N-acetylcysteine has been used in other research to treat psychiatric symptoms. We randomized 153 people, half to placebo, half to NAC. The compliance with the medication was suboptimal. This is typical of stimulant treatment trials, but makes it very hard to pick up a signal. You'll see that on average, 66% of the doses were taken by our participants. In terms of the data we had to analyze, we had really good data on methamphetamine use days. That was very complete, but for the oral fluid samples, it was less complete because that required face-to-face attendance for the assessments. You can see here our outcomes data on methamphetamine use. The bars represent days of use in the past 28 days. And at the start of the trial, it's 24 days of methamphetamine use in the past 28 days. And that was in both groups for NAC in white and placebo in gray. We didn't get any benefit of N-acetylcysteine on days of use over placebo. And you can see here that both of those groups reduced significantly, but they reduced the same amount. So we didn't get any effect there. The lines show you % of oral fluid tests that came back positive for methamphetamine, and there was no difference between the N-acetylcysteine group with the black squares and placebo with the white circles. In line with this lack of reduction in methamphetamine use, we didn't see any effect on craving, severity of dependence, or withdrawal. You can see here the lines are all very close together. When we look at psychiatric symptoms, we had a lot more variability in the data, so it's a bit hard to pick up effects, but we didn't see any benefits in terms of reducing the paranoia and hallucinations that people get when they use methamphetamine. We didn't see any significant benefits on depression. It looks like there might have been an effect on suicidality. You can see here the purple line is the N-acetylcysteine group. However, that wasn't statistically significant. And with hostility, we got a trend toward reduced hostility in the N-acetylcysteine group compared to the placebo group. But our cutoff for what constituted a clinically significant, statistically significant effect was 0.01, and we got a 0.02. So we can't actually say confidently that N-acetylcysteine reduced hostility. So in conclusion, it didn't work. It didn't reduce methamphetamine use, and N-acetylcysteine in this dose also didn't reduce craving or severity of dependence or psychiatric symptoms. There was some signal that it might reduce hostility, but we cannot confirm that based on this study. If you're interested in the full findings, this is an open access publication that you can get from our website, www.nicetrial.info. So please go there and have a look. Not having got a positive finding didn't deter us. We've now moved on and we're conducting the next trial, which is called the TINA trial. This is a phase 3 double-blind randomized controlled placebo-controlled trial of mirtazapine. I'd just like to acknowledge the various services through which we are working to implement this trial. The rationale for mirtazapine, as I'm sure most of you would know, is it's a common antidepressant, but it's also been found to have benefit for methamphetamine use. That's been found in 2 phase 2 trials. Both of them were conducted in the USA on men who have sex with men. And they found that 30 milligrams a day was associated with reduced levels of methamphetamine use. And in the second larger trial, they also found improvements in depression and reductions in insomnia. But these are very constrained trials conducted in very controlled environments with psychological therapy support on very specific populations. So what we felt was that we need to see what happens if you were to put this into routine clinical practice. Would you see the same kind of benefits that have been seen in these trials? So we've received funding from the Medical Research Future Fund, and we'll be implementing this trial through Geelong, Wollongong, Perth and Brisbane, and hopefully additional sites that we are yet to confirm. And we'll be looking at whether 12 weeks of mirtazapine can improve outcomes compared to placebo. Our target sample is 340 people dependent on meth. We'll be starting recruitment next year for a couple of years that will be running. And please keep an eye on our website if you're interested in this trial. That's www.tinatrial.info. And just to close very quickly, a glimmer of hope. In the meantime, since we sought funding for this trial, some researchers in the USA, including one of our co-investigators on the TINA trial, Steve Shoptower, have found they've been trialing kind of combinations of different pharmacotherapies to see if that works better. And they've struck gold with a combination of bupropion and naltrexone. It's a long-acting bupropion, extended release bupropion, and injectable form of naltrexone. And with this, you can see here the naltrexone bupropion group, in terms of percentage negative urine samples in the pink, is outperforming the placebo group quite significantly. It's a very complex trial design, and they basically took placebo non-responders and put them on the active medication and still got benefits in these otherwise treatment non-responders. So fairly compelling results, and this is only one trial, but hopefully they'll replicate this and we'll have some good news on that front as well. That's all from me today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for that very precise and well-timed presentation. We now move on to the poster presentations. We'll have a sequence of brief poster presentations, and then we'll have a Q&A after that. So straight over to the poster presentations.
Hello, my name's Mark, and my presentation's on e-cigarettes. A 2017 study found that use of e-cigarettes may reduce the success of smoking cessation attempts in countries where regulations regarding their use are restrictive. In Australia, the sale of nicotine e-cigarettes is effectively banned, and it's illegal to use them without a prescription from a doctor. As far as I'm aware, there's no population estimate of the effect of e-cigarettes on smoking cessation success in Australia, and this makes it difficult to assess the public health impact of current policy. So I fitted a logistic regression model to 2019 National Drug Strategy Household Survey data. 1,608 respondents provided information on the success of quit attempts in Australia in 2019. Of these, 160 used e-cigarettes. It's likely that people that source their e-cigarettes from overseas websites are more likely to use nicotine in their e-cigarettes. So I fitted a second model where I looked separately at vapers that used overseas websites to source their e-cigarettes from other vapers. From the first model, I found that people that used e-cigarettes overall had twice the odds of success as people that didn't use e-cigarettes. And from the second model, I found that people that sourced their e-cigarettes from overseas websites, as well as those that used other sources, both had significantly higher odds of success than people that didn't use e-cigarettes. There's some suggestion that people that sourced their e-cigarettes from overseas websites had higher success odds than other vapers, but it's inconclusive. Among other aids, there's only evidence that people that used smartphone apps had greater success than people that didn't use smartphone apps.
Hello, my name is Alice Havard. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at both NDARC and the Centre for Big Data Research in Health. I'll be presenting the findings of our study comparing the cardiovascular safety of different quit smoking medicines. Smoking cessation pharmacotherapies are the most effective way to help people quit smoking. Although there have been concerns about the cardiovascular safety of these medicines, there is consensus that any increased risk of adverse cardiovascular events is small and outweighed by the benefits of quitting. Given this, clinical guidelines specify that smoking cessation pharmacotherapy should be offered to everyone who wants to quit smoking. But in the interest of minimising risk to patients, prescribers need evidence on how these medicines compare in terms of cardiovascular safety. We conducted a large observational study comparing the cardiovascular safety of the 3 smoking cessation medicines available in Australia. The focus of this presentation will be on the results of varenicline and nicotine patches, which are much more commonly used than the third medicine, bupropion. We obtained linked data for this study, specifically pharmaceutical dispensing data linked with hospital admission and death records. Using the pharmaceutical records, we identified all New South Wales residents dispensed varenicline or nicotine patches between 2011 and 2015. We followed these people from the day they were first dispensed the pharmacotherapy until they discontinued the therapy or switched to another. We used the diagnoses in hospital admission and death records to identify cardiovascular events occurring during this follow-up period. Our primary outcome was major adverse cardiovascular events, known as MACE, which was a composite of acute coronary syndrome, stroke, and cardiovascular death. We used propensity scores to account for potential confounding and survival analysis to calculate hazard ratios. The hazard ratios indicate that there was no difference between varenicline and nicotine patches in the risk of MACE, acute coronary syndrome, or stroke. They show a reduction in the risk of cardiovascular death among varenicline users. This finding that varenicline is no more harmful than nicotine patches and may even be protective against some cardiovascular outcomes is really encouraging because varenicline is the most effective of the pharmacotherapies. This new evidence suggests that clinicians can prescribe varenicline in preference to nicotine patches without increasing patients' risk of major cardiovascular events. This should have the downstream effect of more smoking cessation.
Welcome to this presentation on drug-related hospitalization and drug-induced death by remoteness area using Australia-wide administrative data sets. The aims of this study is firstly to describe and compare overall age standardized rates in drug-related hospitalization and drug-induced death by remoteness area, and then to further compare those rates by specific drugs involved. We focus on opioids, amphetamines, cocaine, and cannabinoids in this presentation. To undertake the study, we identified drug-related hospitalization in the financial year 2018 to 19 using drug-related ICD codes under the principal diagnostic field from the National Hospital Morbidity Database. Preliminary data on drug-induced death occurring in the years 2018 to 2019 were identified using ICD codes under the underlying cause of death field in the cause of death data. Details are described under the hospitalization and mortality data tabs here. ICD codes shown in this table are used to identify specific drugs involved. More than one drug may be involved in the hospitalization or death, and more than one drug may be involved in each of these drug types. The next two tabs describe results of the study, which is shown here, but I'm showing you the results in the figure tab here, which I will whiz through. Overall age standardized rate of hospitalization is highest in outer regional areas, followed by remote and very remote areas. Compared with other remoteness areas, outer regional areas also have the highest rate of hospitalization involving amphetamines. And for remote and very remote areas, they have the highest rate for hospitalizations involving cannabinoids. With deaths, the highest overall rate is observed in the inner regional areas and the lowest in remote and very remote areas. Inner regional areas also have the highest rates of drug-induced death involving opioids, amphetamines, which is similar to major cities, and cannabinoids. These findings need to be interpreted in the light of data limitations. There are administrative differences between jurisdictions and remoteness areas that may impact estimates. The ICD coding determined the drugs that could be studied. Important differences between remoteness areas in drug harms and the type of drugs involved, which suggests that targeted and specific treatment services may be needed to reduce harms in the different regions of Australia.
Well, I'm Don Weatherburn, and I'm just going to say a few words about who would try or use more cannabis if it were legal. But first, I should acknowledge my co-investigators in this project, Shane Dark, Emma Zara, and Michael Farrell. Well, most people think that cannabis is a fairly benign drug, and to a large extent that's true, but it does have some adverse effects. Certainly 1 in 10, for example, who regularly use cannabis end up dependent on it. And cannabis has a number of rare but quite serious side effects, and I've listed them there. They include things like psychosis and depression, but also some serious physical illnesses. Naturally, people are concerned about the prospect of legalizing cannabis if these problems become more acute. And naturally, there have been a lot of people attempting to find out what would happen if we legalize cannabis. Unfortunately, the evidence is mixed. Some studies find that there's no effect after decriminalization of cannabis. Other studies, and I've listed them here, find increased use after legalization of cannabis use. In Australia, we're fortunate in having a question in the National Drug Strategy Household Survey that actually asked people whether they would use cannabis if it was legal or use more if it was legal, assuming they're current users. So that survey simply asked people, would you, if it was legal, not use it, try it, use it about as often as you do now, use it more often than now, or use it less often than now? And we analysed the responses to that survey, and the results were as follows. 4.2% of the population aged 14 and over, that's about 883,000 people who've never tried cannabis before, would try it if use of the drug were made legal. 2.6% of the population aged 14 and over, that's a bit over 500,000 people, would use more cannabis if its use were made legal. And of course, the critical question is, who would use it more often if it were made legal? And the answer to that question is the users tend to be male, they tend to be younger, aged 14 to 19, they tend to be experiencing psychological stress, and interestingly, they tend not to be current frequent users of the drug. So what conclusion do we make out of all this? Well, we say that if cannabis use is legalised, we may need to increase expenditure on drug treatment and education. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those brief presentations of significant work. We now have the opportunity to have some questions around any of those topics that we have been discussing over the last while. I don't know if we're going to have other panelists on with us here. And I have a range of questions that people have put up, and some of them have been answered, but I think I'll just wait for people to come on. There's a question there for Jonathan in relation to how Jonathan, how you compare your work to the work done by Peter Hendrick's group, and what differences you think there are.
Peter, who we're collaborating with, describes this really interesting situation of working with a population that have virtually no experience of psychedelics, who are predominantly African-American, low socioeconomic status and so on. And he describes these encounters of the participants saying, look, I don't know what these crazy white men drugs are, but I've tried everything else and I'm willing to give it anything a shot at this point. So the interesting thing about his study is that there's very little expectancy effects that come with the psilocybin, very little personal use. which makes it interesting. The other thing that's sort of come out of his work that's really interesting as well is in the area where he's practicing, there's quite high rates of sort of religiosity and, you know, people having being Christian, and the flavor of the psychedelic experience was very much sort of along those lines. And so his, you know, part of his thinking was a sense of awe and possibly even religiosity might be a treatment effect modifier. For having, you know, people have a framework to sort of conceptualize the psychedelic experience already in that setting. So, you know, quite different to our treatment population who, you know, may well be psychedelic experienced, and yeah, socioeconomically sort of maybe a little different as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Jonathan. Nadine, over to you. I wonder if you'd like to just give us an overview of this session and where you think we'll be going next with some of these work and where the exciting potentials are.
Yeah, great question. I noticed that Rebecca finished the last study was a mention of Maduka Trivedi's work, and he's actually going to be presenting to the NCRED Symposium in November on that if people have specific queries they want to put to him, because I think that is an interesting question for us in Australia. Rebecca didn't have time to go into it, but that's a combination of naltrexone and bupropion. In the US, they have an injectable long-acting preparation of naltrexone, which we don't have available here. So if we were to trial it here in Australia, we would be looking at having probably an oral preparation as probably the most feasible. So, but it is I think of interest to us to trial that in the Australian context. And I do still retain interest in the so-called agonist therapies for methamphetamine use disorder. The question will be, we obviously need more than one trial. As you know, we're scientists, we need more than one positive trial. And the question, even if we do show them to be effective, it's in what kind of delivery mechanism, how do we also ensure that people have access to psychosocial supports, how do we ensure accessibility in terms of funding for it and not too tightly regulated as a medication. So there's a whole range of kind of regulatory and translational aspects that we need to explore, even if we do find positive signals from one drug. Pretty excited by Liam's work with the withdrawal medication, because we don't have anything to offer people in that acute phase. And while withdrawal will never we don't expect withdrawal to change treatment outcomes. So even a medication that's hugely successful in helping people get through that first period, it can provide then an important component of people's treatment. So again, looking forward to how we would embed those treatments into our treatment system. We don't want to replicate errors we've made as a health system in the past, where there is a magic pill for something. There is never a magic pill for anything. It is always delivered in context with other kind of supports around it. And that's where it ties back, I think, to the really interesting work with the psychedelics. And we need to be very intelligent and not I think we need to maintain our healthy skepticism around the psychedelics. I'm not saying that they don't have a place, but that if we have too much zealousness, the second anything is seen as a treatment for everything simultaneously, we will lose potentially the therapeutic aspects of that. So if we go in cautiously and rigorous in our thinking, then we may this time not lose the potential therapeutic opportunities, at least lose this opportunity to explore the therapeutic opportunities for some of those medications.
Yeah, just before finishing with you, I mean, firstly, to congratulate you with all your efforts to try and develop translational clinically translational work, and you really have flown the flag on that incredibly well. But one of the things I'm struck by is just how difficult it is to actually come up with a rigorous study that can be translated into everyday clinical practice in this area. Do you want to comment at all on that?
Yeah, I mean, in two ways. So one is, yes, we can insert our treatments into existing treatment frameworks And I'm thinking there like the kind of massive uptake of pharmaceutical antidepressants. I mean, that would be fairly easy to insert kind of low to moderate use disorder treatment that has a pharmaceutical component into primary care and maybe some sort of low level specialist care. That would be reasonably, I think, possible. What I'm curious about is whether we will have learnings about how we deliver care from some of the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy research, whether we might then be actually shaken up in our service delivery systems. And COVID has really, I think it has accelerated our capacity to start delivering care through mechanisms other than your pretty old-fashioned office-based care or hospital-based care. And we need to be also taking advantage of that time now to be looking at how we can deliver telehealth delivered care that is not just replicating and perhaps an inferior replication of face-to-face care, or a cheaper to deliver replication of face-to-face care or self-delivered kind of online care. We've got an opportunity to actually expand all of those treatment modalities and join them up in different ways. And I think we should be seizing that now as COVID is sort of shaking things up and potentially throwing in a little bit of tripping onto that too, to rephrase how we might deliver care.
Fantastic. And over to Nadine there, sorry, over to Rebecca there. Look, what I'm hearing across the morning session was, we've heard about psychedelics, but the other issue was challenges in engaging people in treatment. And what would be the ways in which you might radically think about the processes of engagement? And psychotherapy seems to be one of them, but it's probably not the only one. Anything from you, Nadine?
Nadine or Rebecca?
Sorry, Rebecca. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I was sitting here thinking, you know, we always talk about how we're going to improve clinical services. And when we go out in the community and we talk to people who use methamphetamine, including people who are using at levels where they're experiencing harms and symptoms of dependence, we're looking at maybe 10% of them having received specialist alcohol and other drug services within the past year. So we have got a large proportion of people who are just not accessing these services. And we really need to look at the broader services that are available that they are accessing. And a lot of that is around primary health care and generic services, and see whether we can engage with them through those services, I think, in terms of what services we deliver.
Okay, Jonathan, any thoughts on that? You're muted.
It's really hard to top that. I think just commenting on what Nadine was saying, yeah, I think we do need to be really cautious about psychedelic research, because we certainly don't want a recurrence of what happened in the 70s. And I think, you know, there's a lot in sort of question at the moment around how these drugs should be scheduled, you know, whether to sort of facilitate research and so on. So I definitely share the sentiment there of the need for scientific rigor and so on. I think it's all about models of care for me and how treatment's delivered. Thinking about that as well as, you know, specific therapies. Because I think we've got a lot to think about there, and you know, what Rebecca was saying in terms of reducing the barriers to access to care as well, and you know, helping people access care locally, you know, regional, thinking about regional remote centres that are really affected as well. But I think Nadine and Rebecca have summarised that really well. So.
Okay, I'll go over to Wayne, Professor Wayne Hall there, who's sitting patiently, and ask him for his few words on this topic.
I think I probably said what I needed to say earlier, and you know, I share Nadine's need for skepticism, and we don't want to be persuading people that this is a magic bullet. The psychedelics are magic bullets to treat, you know, all psychiatric diagnoses. They may well have a role, and we need the clinical trial evidence to do that. And I agree. I mean, it's hard to do clinical trials well in these sorts of settings, and if you're doing trials with a pretty substantial time investment in psychotherapy, as well as the pharmacotherapy, at the level it typically goes up. When you're looking at drugs, you know, where it's hard to disguise the effect of the active agent from placebo, it's a bit more difficult, I think, and obviously we need longer term follow-ups to see whether the sorts of impressive results in the short term that are often reported are sustained over the longer haul, particularly with disorders like the ones we're treating, which are chronic and often recurring. And people have, difficult social circumstances that are what precipitated their drug problems in the first place. That aren't resolved by taking a psilocybin or another psychedelic drug.
Yes, so I was struck by the issue of the background of social inequities and developmental disadvantage and adversity, and how that actually factors into whatever sorts of treatments we come up with. But the argument for psychotherapy or some sorts of social support mechanisms around that is also compelling in its own direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difficulty, we didn't talk about MDMA because it's PTSD, it's primarily used to treat, but a treatment that involves something like 15 hours of psychotherapy and preparation is not something we can roll out on an upscale to treat the more common problems that we face in the addiction area. And it's going to be very difficult to fund that. So we have to look for the sort of more compromised models, I think, briefer psychotherapies that fit into the sort of plausible treatment models that can be provided at scale to our clients.
Right. Well, look, I'd like to thank all my panelists and thank you very much for all your presentations and discussion today. And I'd like to simply thank everybody who's been involved and all the listeners who most of you have stuck with us. And I'd like to remind you that we have a session again tomorrow morning, and that session will be with David Courtright and Louisa Degenhardt and other presenters around opiate issues and related issues. And on Friday, we will have the drug trends presentation. So I'd encourage you to sign up and come back tomorrow. And in the meantime, have a good day and stay safe.